Your group has a problem, not an immediate crisis. Nobody is injured, the food situation is manageable, the shelter is holding. The problem is subtler than that, and in some ways more serious, because it is the kind of problem that does not announce itself dramatically. It accumulates quietly, across generations, in ways that are difficult to see until the damage is already done. Your group has 23 people. Of those 23, the adults of reproductive age number 11. Of those 11, several are siblings. Several more are cousins. First cousins, close enough in genetic terms that pairing them would produce offspring carrying doubled-up copies of whatever genetic vulnerabilities they share. The options for new reproductive partnerships within the group, when you actually map them out, are limited in a way that is beginning to matter. This is not a hypothetical problem invented for this video. This is the specific, recurring, existential challenge of small group human life. A challenge that every ancient human community that ever existed had to navigate continuously, carefully, and with enough sophistication to avoid the genetic catastrophe that inbreeding can produce over the span of a few generations. And here is the thing. They did navigate it successfully for hundreds of thousands of years, without genetics textbooks, without the concept of recessive alleles, without any formal understanding of the mechanisms by which inbreeding causes harm. Ancient humans solved one of evolutionary biology's hardest practical problems using tools that were behavioral, social, cultural, and instinctive. And the solutions they developed were sophisticated enough to keep our species genetically healthy across the entire span of ancient human existence. How? That is exactly what we are going to find out. Let's start with why inbreeding is actually harmful, because understanding the biological problem is essential for appreciating how genuinely impressive the ancient solutions were. Every human being carries in their genome a collection of deleterious recessive alleles, genetic variants that cause harm when present in two copies, but are harmless or nearly harmless when only one copy is present. The human genome is extraordinarily large, and the normal process of mutation produces new deleterious variants continuously. Most of these variants are rare in the population because they are removed by natural selection when they are expressed, when an individual unluckily inherits two copies. But in any given individual, there may be dozens to hundreds of these variants sitting silently in one copy, masked by a functional version of the same gene on the other chromosome. When two closely related individuals reproduce, the probability that their offspring will inherit two copies of one of these deleterious variants, inheriting the same damaged gene from both parents, increases dramatically. First-degree relatives share approximately 50% of their genetic variants. First cousins share approximately 12.5%. This sharing means that the recessive deleterious variants that one relative carries are far more likely to be present in the other relative as well, and therefore far more likely to be present in two copies in their offspring. The consequences of this genetic doubling are well documented. Children of closely related parents show elevated rates of developmental abnormalities, immune system deficiencies, reduced cognitive function in some cases, elevated susceptibility to certain diseases, and reduced overall fitness in measures ranging from birth weight to reproductive success in adulthood. In small closed populations where inbreeding persists across multiple generations, these effects compound. The population's overall genetic load increases, average fitness declines, and the population becomes progressively more vulnerable to the kind of disease or environmental challenge that wipes out genetically compromised populations. For ancient human groups living in small bands, this was not a theoretical concern. It was a practical existential threat. A group of 20 to 30 individuals, genetically isolated over several generations, would begin to show these effects within a remarkably short period. The archaeological and genetic record of ancient populations that became isolated, island populations, populations trapped by glacial barriers, populations reduced to very small numbers by catastrophic events, shows exactly the genetic signatures of inbreeding that the theory predicts. Ancient humans who failed to manage this problem left fewer descendants. Ancient humans who managed it successfully are the reason we exist. Let's talk about the biological toolkit first, the instinctive mechanisms that evolution built into human psychology as a first line of defense against inbreeding. The Westermark effect is the most important and most fascinating of these mechanisms. First described by Finnish anthropologist Edvard Westermark in 1891, the Westermark effect is the observation that humans who live in close physical proximity during the first few years of life, develop a specific aversion to sexual contact with each other, an aversion that operates below conscious awareness and is remarkably resistant to conscious override. This is not a learned rule, it is an automatic psychological response triggered by a specific developmental experience. Shared early childhood in close domestic proximity. The mechanism appears to be calibrated for the domestic unit as a proxy for genetic relatedness. In the environments in which it evolved, individuals who shared your domestic space during early childhood were almost always your close genetic relatives, because ancient domestic units were family units. The evidence for the Westermark effect is substantial and comes from multiple independent sources. The most famous comes from the Israeli kibbutz system, where unrelated children raised together in communal peer groups from infancy show the same aversion to sexual contact with each other that close relatives show. Studies found that despite no cultural prohibition and no genetic relationship, children raised together in the same peer cohort from the first years of life virtually never married each other, and reported finding each other sexually unappealing. The mechanism was triggered by the shared early childhood experience, even in the absence of genetic relationship. Conversely, individuals who are closely related but who did not share early childhood proximity do not experience the Westermark aversion, a phenomenon called genetic sexual attraction in the psychological literature, which describes the intense and often unwanted attraction that some adults experience when reunited with close genetic relatives from whom they were separated as children. The aversion is not to genetic relatedness per se. It is to the specific developmental experience of close early childhood proximity. The genetic relatedness is just what that experience normally predicted. For ancient humans, this mechanism was operating constantly and effectively. Children raised together in the same domestic group, siblings, half-siblings, close cousins who shared the family living space, developed the specific aversion that prevented mating between the most closely related group members. This required no conscious decision-making, no knowledge of genetics, no cultural rule. It was automatic, instinctive, and precisely calibrated for the problem it was solving. But the Westermark effect, while necessary, is not sufficient. It prevents mating between those who shared early childhood proximity. It does not prevent mating between more distant relatives who did not share that proximity. For a small group of 20 to 30 individuals, many of whom may be related at the cousin or second cousin level without having shared early childhood in the same domestic unit, additional mechanisms were needed. This is where the social and cultural layer becomes critical, and where the evidence of ancient human behavioral sophistication becomes genuinely impressive. The fundamental behavioral solution to the inbreeding problem in small groups is exogamy, the practice of obtaining reproductive partners from outside your immediate social group rather than from within it. Exogamy is one of the most universal features of human social organization documented in anthropological research. The specific rules governing who counts as outside vary enormously across cultures and times. But the basic principle that reproductive partnerships should be formed between individuals from different social units rather than within the same unit is found in every traditional human society that has been studied with sufficient depth to identify its mating rules. Exogamy is not just a cultural preference, it is a behavioral solution to a biological problem, and ancient humans appear to have developed and maintained it long before the agricultural period. The genetic evidence from ancient human remains is one of the most powerful demonstrations of this. Studies of ancient DNA from hunter-gatherer sites in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere consistently show patterns of genetic diversity that are incompatible with closed, inbreeding populations. The genetic variation present in ancient communities was maintained at levels that required ongoing gene flow between groups. The regular introduction of new genetic material from outside the local group through reproductive partnerships. One study of ancient hunter-gatherer genetics from a site in Belgium dating to approximately 35,000 years ago found that the individuals buried there showed genetic patterns suggesting that females in the group had come from different genetic populations than the males, consistent with a system where women moved between groups at reproductive age to form partnerships outside their birth group, while men tended to remain in their birth group. This is the specific genetic signature of female exogamy, a pattern in which women leave their natal group to mate with unrelated men in other groups, or men from other groups come to mate with women in the resident group. Let's talk about the logistical infrastructure of ancient exogamy, because maintaining outbreeding partnerships between separate small groups required a level of social organization that is both impressive oppressive and underappreciated. Outbreeding requires contact. Contact requires relationships. Relationships between separate groups require maintenance over time. The specific mechanisms through which ancient groups maintained the intergroup relationships that made exogamy possible represent some of the most important social technology in ancient human history. The first mechanism is periodic aggregation. The regular coming together of multiple separate bands into larger gatherings at specific times and places. Evidence for these aggregations comes from multiple directions. Archaeological sites that show evidence of significantly larger than normal group occupation during specific seasons, often associated with periods of maximum resource availability, like major salmon runs, large game aggregations, or periods of abundant plant food, show the material signatures of many groups converging on one location simultaneously. The density of material culture, the diversity of raw materials from different geographic sources, the evidence of communal feasting at a scale beyond what a single band would produce, all of these are signatures of interband aggregation. These gatherings were not purely logistical. They were the occasions on which intergroup relationships were maintained, alliances were negotiated, disputes between groups were resolved, and, critically, young people from different groups encountered potential reproductive partners. The young man or woman who attended a seasonal aggregation encountered individuals their own age from multiple other groups, with whom they shared no close genetic relationship and with whom they were not experiencing the Westermark effect. This was the ancient marriage market, the social mechanism through which the exogamous partnerships that prevented inbreeding were actually formed. The gift exchange and trade networks that connected ancient groups across large territories served a related function. The maintenance of long-distance exchange relationships, the sending of valued objects across hundreds of kilometers of territory, as recorded by the distribution of specific raw materials at ancient sites, created and sustained the social relationships between groups that made intergroup mating possible. You do not send your daughter to marry into a group you have no relationship with. You send her to a group your family has been exchanging gifts with for 2 generations, whose members you know by name and reputation, with whom you have the trust and the ongoing relationship that makes such an arrangement workable. Ancient trade was not merely economic. It was the physical expression of the social bonds that kept separate groups connected in ways that served, among other functions, the crucial genetic purpose of preventing the reproductive isolation that leads to inbreeding. Let's talk about kinship systems, because ancient humans developed remarkably sophisticated social structures for organizing and regulating reproductive partnerships in ways that explicitly prevented inbreeding. Kinship terminology systems, the specific ways that different cultures classify relatives and distinguish between those who are appropriate and those who are inappropriate as reproductive partners, are one of the most extensively studied features of human social organization. And the cross-cultural diversity of these systems, combined with their universal concern with preventing reproductive partnerships between specific categories of relatives, tells us something important about how long and how seriously ancient humans took this problem. The most basic universal feature of kinship systems is the incest taboo, the prohibition on sexual contact between specific categories of close relatives. The incest taboo is one of the most universal features of human culture, present in every society that has been studied, though with significant variation in exactly which relatives are included in the prohibited category. Universality of this kind, in the specific domain of a behavior with clear biological consequences, is strong evidence of an ancient origin. The incest taboo does more than prevent the most extreme forms of inbreeding. It is the explicit, culturally transmitted, consciously maintained reinforcement of the Westermark effect, taking the automatic aversion that biology provides and encoding it in cultural rules that extend its scope, communicate it explicitly, and provide social enforcement for cases where the biological mechanism alone might be insufficient. Beyond the incest taboo, many traditional societies have developed positive marriage rules, rules that specify not just who you cannot marry, but who you should marry. The most widespread of these is cross-cousin marriage, the system in which marriage is encouraged or prescribed between a person and their cross-cousins, the children of their mother's brother or their father's sister, while marriage to parallel cousins, the children of their mother's sister or their father's brother, is prohibited. This system, documented across many traditional societies, maintains ongoing alliance relationships between specific family lines, while preventing the closer inbreeding that would occur with parallel cousins. Cross-cousin marriage rules are not, by modern genetic standards, Ideal? First cousins share 12.5% of their genome, and their offspring carry an elevated risk of homozygosity for deleterious variants. But in the context of ancient small group life, where the alternative in the absence of intergroup contact might be even closer inbreeding, cross-cousin marriage rules that embedded outbreeding partnerships in a stable system of ongoing family alliances represented a pragmatic solution to the logistical challenge of maintaining exogamous relationships over time. Let's talk about the genetic evidence from ancient populations, because this is where the story gets validated in ways that are genuinely remarkable. Ancient DNA studies have now analyzed genomic material from hundreds of ancient individuals spanning tens of thousands of years of human history, and the findings consistently show patterns of genetic diversity and structure that confirm the effectiveness of ancient outbreeding practices. Studies of Paleolithic hunter-gatherer populations across Europe show levels of heterozygosity, the measure of genetic diversity within individuals, that are inconsistent with inbred populations. Ancient individuals from sites spanning thousands of years of occupation show the ongoing introduction of new genetic material from outside their immediate community, reflected in the presence of ancestry components that are not fully shared with other members of the same archaeological culture. The specific signature of the female exogamy pattern, where mitochondrial DNA diversity within a site is lower than Y chromosome diversity, reflecting the movement of females from diverse maternal lineages coming together in one group while males stayed in their birth community, has been documented at multiple ancient sites. This is the direct genetic fingerprint of the behavioral pattern we would predict from a system designed to bring in unrelated females from other groups. Conversely, the genetic signatures of actual inbreeding, runs of homozygosity, elevated identity by descent in comparisons between individuals at the same site, are present at some ancient sites, but at levels that are generally much lower than would be expected from closed, reproductively isolated populations. When they do appear at elevated levels, they tend to be associated with specific circumstances consistent with population isolation, island populations, populations in geographically constrained environments, populations reduced to very small numbers by catastrophic events. The general pattern across ancient human populations is one of successful management of inbreeding risk through the behavioral and social mechanisms we have described. Ancient humans were not accidentally avoiding inbreeding. They were actively, systematically, and effectively preventing it. Let me talk about something that rarely gets discussed in this context but is directly relevant: the role of women in the ancient exogamy system. In many documented traditional societies with exogamous mating patterns, it is women who move between groups at reproductive age rather than men. This is called patrilocal residence, the pattern in which men remain in their birth community while women leave to join their partners' communities. It is one of the most widespread residence patterns in traditional human societies, and the ancient DNA evidence from multiple sites is consistent with this pattern having a very long history. What this means for the individual women involved is profound and rarely acknowledged. A young woman in an ancient community practicing patrilical exogamy would, at some point in her teens or early 20s, leave the community she had grown up in, the group of people who had been her entire social world from birth, and move to a different community, potentially at significant geographic distance, to live among people who were not her close relatives, in partnership with a man she may have met only at seasonal aggregation gatherings. This transition was enormous. It required crossing from the familiar to the unfamiliar, from the community where she knew every face and every relationship to one where she was initially an outsider. It required building new social relationships from scratch, establishing her position in a new community's social hierarchy, and doing all of this while also navigating the demands of a new reproductive partnership. The social infrastructure that ancient communities developed to support this transition, the ongoing relationships between the natal and the new community that kept the woman connected to her birth family, the gift exchanges that maintained those connections materially, the mechanisms through which her natal community retained interest in her welfare and could intervene if necessary, was as important as the exogamy system itself. Exogamy works only if the women who implement it are supported through the transition, and ancient communities appear to have understood and provided for this need in ways that made the system sustainable over generations. Here is the bottom line, delivered with the weight it deserves. Ancient humans solved one of the hardest problems in small group reproductive biology without a single textbook without a genetic counselor, and without understanding the molecular mechanisms through which inbreeding causes harm. They solved it using a layered system of biological instincts, behavioral practices, social institutions, and cultural rules that together produced levels of genetic diversity and reproductive health sufficient to sustain our species through hundreds of thousands of years of small group life. The Westermark effect provided automatic aversion to mating with those who shared early childhood proximity. The incest taboo extended and culturally reinforced that aversion. Periodic intergroup aggregations created the social opportunities for outbreeding partnerships. Long-distance trade and gift exchange maintained the intergroup relationships that made those partnerships possible. Kinship systems and marriage rules provided explicit guidance about which partnerships were appropriate and which were not. Female exogamy and patrilocal residence patterns created the genetic structure that the ancient DNA record confirms was actually operating in ancient populations. This is not a simple story of instinct overriding a potential problem. It is a multi-layered system, biological and cultural, instinctive and deliberately maintained, that shows the same kind of sophisticated, multi-generational, social problem-solving that we see in ancient responses to every other serious survival challenge. Ancient humans understood, in the practical rather than theoretical sense, that reproductive partnerships needed to reach beyond the immediate community. They built social structures to make that possible. They maintained those structures across generations because the consequences of failing to do so were visible and serious. Back to your group of 23 people. The young woman who has been quietly observing the young man from the neighboring group at the last 2 seasonal gatherings, the one from the Valley community, the one whose face she has been thinking about since the autumn meeting. That situation is not accidental. It is the system working exactly as it was designed to work. Her community will facilitate the connection. Both families will exchange gifts. Relationships will be formalized in whatever ceremonial framework the community uses for this purpose. The genetic problem gets solved. Another generation survives with full genetic health. Ancient humans figured this out a very long time ago.
That's today's Brain Snack. Subscribe so you never miss a bite.